It's ready. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of our afternoon talks. Our speaker, George Capps, has researched the background story of what will be celebrated tomorrow of the arrival of Catholic missionaries to the Rocky Mountains with the Mass on the Prairie. There's a backstory to that that is fascinating and traces all the way back to Quebec. And George's extensive research has pinned down the identity of the person who became known as the Apostle of the Flatheads. So I'm going to introduce George. He can tell you a lot more about it than I can.
So good afternoon, everyone. As Scott mentioned, my name is George Capps, and I'm delighted to be here. I hail from St. Louis, Missouri, where I live with my lovely wife, Mary Rose. And perhaps I say where we will live because we were actually married 2 weeks ago today, and we're on our way back from our honeymoon in Hawaii. So if I seem unusually tan, you'll know why. And if I'm not as well prepared for this presentation as I would ordinarily be, hopefully you'll understand. One other disclaimer at the outset, during the course of the presentation, we will encounter a number of Iroquois personal and place names. I'm going to do my best to pronounce them correctly, but I'm sure I won't do so perfectly. So if any of those listening online are proficient in the Mohawk language, I apologize in advance for any mistakes and ask for your patience. So with that said, let's dive right in. Our topic today will be uncovering the fur trade career of Grand Ignace, the so-called Apostle of the Flatheads. So Grand Ignace means Big Ignatius in French, and he was nicknamed Big because of his tall stature. And so we're going to start by discussing the traditional version of his biography, who he was, what role he played in the history of the Rocky Mountain West. And then we're going to discuss the limitations of that traditional story and why we as historians want to learn more. I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk talking about the detective work that is involved in figuring out by what name he appears in the contemporary fur trade records of the 1810s and 1820s. And then once we've done that, we'll discuss the implications, why these discoveries are important and why it all matters. So the classic account of Grand Ignace's story was penned by the Jesuit historian Lawrence Benedict Palladino in the late 19th century. And Palladino called him Ignace Lamuse. That surname Lamuse, it turns out, is a misnomer. It was inaccurately applied to him after his death. But because Palladino's account has been so definitive, it's really influenced all other writers. You will often see Grand Ignace described as Ignace Lamuse in the secondary literature. But according to Palladino's account, Grand Ignace was an Iroquois wanderer from Kahnawake, which was a community of Christian Mohawk ministered to by the Jesuits just outside of Montreal in Quebec. And according to this account, he left home sometime in the 1910s, the 1810s, and started wandering westward. And eventually he made it 2,000 miles all the way across the continent to the Bitterroot Valley in what is today Western Montana. Keep in mind, this is just about 15 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition. So this vast interior of North America is still really a blank spot on the map to most of the outside world. But he made his way there, again, settled among the friendly Salish, Flathead, and Pend d'Oreille peoples whom he met there. Now, having grown up at Kahnawake, Gra Ignace was a devout Catholic. And the people that he settled with really respected him, and they were fascinated by his religious rituals and this belief system that he brought with him from the East. And they really wanted to learn more and find out how they could become integrated into a similar kind of cosmological system. And so according to Father Palladino's account, Gra Ignace said, well, you have to get these black robe teachers to come and tell you everything about the religion. And so the chief said, well, how do we get them? And Gra Ignace said, well, you have to go back east and ask for them. So finally, after years of pestering, Gra Ignace agreed to go himself all the way to St. Louis, Missouri, to request that Christian missionaries be sent to the Plateau peoples, and in particular, the Salish and Pend d'Oreille, among whom he had settled. And here's the first point at which Palladino's account intersects with the contemporary eyewitness documentary record. Because Gra Ignace brought his 10-year-old son and his 14-year-old stepson with him to St. Louis. He brought them to the embryonic St. Louis University and got a local Jesuit, Father Ferdinand Helias, to baptize the boys. We still have the entry that Father Helias made in the St. Louis University Sacramental Register. Here it is, 2nd of December, 1835, Charles and Francis Xavier, legitimate sons of Ignatius Partui, Indians from the tribe commonly called Flatheads, were solemnly baptized. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to this surname Partui that he gives to Gra Ignace. This has baffled historians for generations. Other than this one spot here and two other kind of narrative accounts that Father Helias wrote of his meeting with Gra Ignace, we have no other reference in the traditional sources to anything like this last name. Typically, Christian Iroquois of this era, if they had to give a surname in a Euro-American context, they would use their given Iroquois name. But this definitely is not an Iroquois name. The phoneme P does not even exist in the Iroquois language. It does not seem to be a Salish term. And so basically, historians have been very confused. Some people think it looks like it's a declined Latin word, but we know from Father Helias's other narrative accounts that he was intending that to be Ignatius's surname. So for right now, we'll comment that it's kind of a puzzle, but this will be important later on, so we'll make note of that. So meanwhile, Gra Ignace in 1836 returns home, and he comes back to the Rendezvous of 1837, hoping to see that some missionary priests have arrived with the westbound caravan from the east. Unfortunately, he's disappointed. There are no black robes. And according to Father Palladino's account, he's so disappointed that he decides to go back to St. Louis again and press his suit further. But unfortunately, this time, on their way, the party is waylaid by hostile Lakota at Ash Hollow in modern-day Nebraska, and all the Indian members of the party, including Gra Ignace, were massacred. There were several white men who were traveling with them who were spared. One of them was the Presbyterian missionary, William H. Gray. He was keeping a diary at the time, and he mentions in the diary the presence on the trip of a big Ignace, which is clearly a garbled reference to Gra Ignace. He provides lots of details about the massacre. And so once again, we have some contemporary eyewitness document that corroborates the general outline of Father Palladino's biography of Gra Ignace. So Gra Ignace dies in 1837, but eventually in 1840, Catholic missionaries do arrive in the Montana region, And quickly, the memory of Gras Ignace grows to epic proportions, and he becomes this sort of mythic hero of the Montana Jesuits' canonical origin story. They dub him the apostle to the Flatheads, and I really like this drawing made by one of the early Montana Jesuits, Nicholas Point, imagining what his death must have been like. And here we see Gras Ignace towering heroically above his perishing companions as he directs their final defense at Ash Hollow. He's riddled with arrows, and they're all beneath this cruciform standard proclaiming the ideals of religion and fatherland for which they are giving their lives. So very idealized. But of course, Gras Ignace was a real person with a real impact on historical events. In terms of his legacy, first and foremost, the larger Jesuit missionary enterprise in the Rocky Mountains owed a lot to his efforts, beginning with the founding of St. Mary's in the Bitterroot Valley by the fabled Flemish Jesuit, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet. And the other major legacy of Gras Ignace is his family, particularly his son, Saksa, who was a tribal member of the Salish community. He was, in fact, the 10-year-old boy who was baptized Francis Xavier in St. Louis. And he lived until 1918. By the end of his life, he was one of the most respected citizens of Western Montana among both whites and Indians, and was just a very well-reputed mediator between the different cultures in that area. So hopefully I've convinced you that Gras Ignace was a very fascinating individual who played a very pivotal role in some interesting history. But hopefully also you realize that there are some definite limitations to the traditional sources that we have about his life. They're mostly filtered through the eyes of this very European worldview and colored by very European ideas of chivalry, martyrdom, evangelization, kind of Christian triumphalism. Definitely really kind of colors his story. And for generations, critical historians have wanted to learn more. They've wanted to dig beneath the layers of hagiography that have accrued to his memory over time, get to that bedrock of truth that would be consistent with his own particular worldview and the cosmology of the Salish people among whom he settled. And they want to know, who exactly was this wanderer? How did he end up in the Bitterroot Valley, 2,000 miles from his home in the 1810s? What motivated him to share his religious beliefs with the people that he met there? And historians have long recognized that answering these questions would require piecing together Gras Ignace's biography from prior to the mid-1830s period that the traditional missionary sources focus on when he was really engaged in this sort of evangelization. And for a long time, historians have recognized that doing that would require understanding what his role was in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Because the traditional sources on Gras Ignace are clear that prior to settling among the Salish, he had in some way been involved with the fur trade companies. And this makes sense, because as many of you may know, the major fur trade companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, actively recruited Christian Mohawks from communities around Montreal by the hundreds. Many of them very early on in the 1810s and 1820s were transferred to the Columbia Department in the West. And actually, a disproportionately large number of them were named Ignace. And this is because St. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuit order. And so Ignace was a very popular name among Jesuit educated Indians. But unfortunately, no one has found any grounds for being able to connect one of the numerous Iroquois named Ignace, who was in the Rocky Mountains in the 1820s, with Gras Ignace. Most historians have been looking for an Ignace Lamuse in the fur trade records. We saw before that's actually a misnomer, so it's not surprising that that search has come up dry. But the lesser known surname we have, Partui, we also don't see anyone named anything like Ignace Partui in the voluminous records of the Northwest Company or the Hudson's Bay Company during this period. So just as recently as 2019, a major tome on the Western Iroquois came out. There's a whole chapter on Grand Ignace, and the scholar who's the world's leading expert really on the Iroquois in the West said we still have no idea how Grand Ignace came to the West, what his backstory was. We just know he was somehow involved in the fur trade. So really the field has been stuck here for over a century. I also was interested in this question, but I realized that making any further progress on it was, if it was even possible, was going to require some very subtle analysis and deep digging. And I made a few discoveries kind of serendipitously that began to set me on what turned out to be the right track. So we'll discuss now these kind of initial clues that first were pointing me in a particular direction. And the first is this hint that Grand Ignace may have been on the 1824 Snake Country expedition. So for those who don't know, the Hudson's Bay Company in the early 1820s realized that the most economical way of harvesting the rich fur resources of Shoshone territory, kind of around modern day Idaho, was to outfit large brigades of what we would call employees and contract workers and send them out into this territory. They would spend most of the year trapping around that larger region. And then at the end of the year, they would bring the large haul of furs that they had accumulated back to one of the northern posts in Hudson Bay Company territory and deliver them there. The officers, often the company officers, often kept detailed diaries and journals, which have been very rich historical resources for scholars working in this area. But there's one journal that's been very underutilized by scholars, and that is Alexander Ross's 1824 Snake Country Expedition Journal. The reason for this is that in the 1910s, a historian published what purported to be a transcript of the journal, but which was in fact a highly abridged summary. So many scholars don't realize that the original manuscript is actually much more voluminous. But if you go back to that original manuscript, it turns out that in 3 places, Ross mentions the presence on the trip of an Iroquois freeman named Big Ignace. So this seems to be the same nickname that Grand Ignace had. Could have been a common nickname, we don't know, but at least it's an intriguing hint that he may have been present on the 1824 Snake Country expedition. And then I realized that there was some very intriguing circumstantial evidence to suggest that he may have been present also in the 1825 Snake Country expedition. And to understand the reason why, we have to realize that according to the traditional sources on Grand Ignace, we know that in approximately 1825, he married a Pinedale woman who had previously been married to another Iroquois. So it could have been that there were multiple times that happened, but it's probably relatively unusual that in 1825, a Pinedale woman would marry an Iroquois who had previously been married to a different Iroquois. Or sorry, she had previously been married to a different Iroquois. Now bear that in mind. Let's look at these entries from the 1825 Snake Country Expedition diaries. The first is from Peter Skeen Ogden, the official diary, Sunday the 6th of February, 1825. I regret that our numbers were diminished last night by the death of Louis Conetagon, an Iroquois. The cause of this was that his wife accidentally shot him in the chest. And his second in command, William Kitson, was also keeping an unofficial diary, and he mentions the same incident and says, this woman was of the Pinedale tribe, and immediately after the burial, a relation of Louis Conetagon immediately took her as his own wife. So here again, we have an Iroquois relation of Louis Conetagon marrying a Pinedale woman who had previously been married to another Iroquois in 1825. Doesn't prove anything, but it is very suggestive that this unnamed relation might have been Grand Ignace. And the final discovery that I made that sort of pointed in a similar direction comes from a letter that Father Helias wrote to his mother. So remember, Father Helias was the St. Louis Jesuit who baptized Grand Ignace's sons. And his mother was a countess back in Belgium. And every once in a while, he would write her letters, "Dear Mom, here are the exciting things that have happened in my life recently." And this letter still exists in an archive in Belgium. It's never been published. It's virtually unknown to scholars of Western history. but we were able to dig it up, and he actually has a whole paragraph talking about this bizarre incident where this man from the Rocky Mountains came to him asking for priests. Here he has the full name, Ignace Paturi or Partui, and he mentions offhand that Gras Ignace was the nephew of a Rocky Mountain Iroquois named Martin. And unlike Ignace, Martin was a very unusual name for Iroquois in the Rocky Mountains west of the Continental Divide. There's really only one man this could possibly be, and that is Martin Simiaquin, sometimes known as Martin Miaquin, who is the leader of what was known as Martin's Band. So in 1818, 17 Iroquois men from the Montreal era formed a partnership, and as a corporate entity, they signed a contract with the Northwest Company to cross the Rocky Mountains and spend 4 years trapping beaver in the Rockies. Very unusual situation. When after their 4 years of service were up in 1822, most of the members of the band remained in the West as freemen. And in fact, a large proportion of the freemen on the 1823 through 1825 Snake Country expeditions were former members of Martin's Band. So putting this, that he was associated with, he was a younger relative of an associate named Martin, the fact that he may have been on these Snake Country expeditions, putting this all together, it really suggested that Gras Ignace may have been a member of Martin's Band. So the next question is, were any members of Martin's Band named Ignace? Answer is yes. Just this line here. No, I'll go back. So I then, before we get to the members of Martin's Band named Ignace, I wanted to learn everything I could about Martin's Band. And as I did so, I realized that there were actually a number of other parallels with what we know about Gras Ignace that turned up. We've already been through these first three right here, but all the traditional sources on Gras Ignace are universally agree that he hailed from Kahnawake. There were three communities of Christian Iroquois from which the Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company recruited, but everyone agrees that Gras Ignace was from Kahnawake. That's exactly where the members of Martin's Band were from. The earliest and most reliable source on when Gras Ignace left home for the Rockies say that it was in 1818. That's exactly the year of the contract signed by Martin's Band. The traditional sources on Gras Ignace consistently say that he was part of a large group of associates ranging in size from 12 to 24 or so. Again, that matches what we know about Martin's Band. It was very unusual for the Iroquois to form a partnership and kind of contract as an entity like that. But again, that jives with what we know about Gras Ignace. And finally, the family oral tradition among Gras Ignace's descendants, as well as early missionary sources, say that when he was in the fur trade, he spent some time on the lower Columbia River, and then he lived for much of the year in Shoshone territory and got to know the Salish and Pend Oreille peoples. And that maps precisely onto the sequence of assignments that were accorded to Martin's Band. So now, this kind of a combination of independent lines of evidence that are all suggesting he may have been a member of Martin's Band. The next question is, were any members of Martin's Band named Ignace? Answer is yes. The first, Ignace Achiaranquas, which means takes a handoff. He was also known as John Gray. He's well known to history. There's a whole chapter on him in Leroy Hafin's Mountain Man biographies. He certainly was not Gras Ignace. Second, Ignace Katnetagon, which means in the pines. He is not listed in the rosters of participants for either the 1824 or the 1825 Snake Country expeditions. But the third, Ignace Tehation Wasere, which means layered his creeks. He was present on the 1824 expedition, so he's at least a candidate to have been the referent of Alexander Ross's Big Ignace moniker. And he was definitely present on the 1825 Snake Country expedition. So he's at least a candidate to have been the relation who married Louis Canettigon's widow. So all this reasoning kind of leads to thinking that Laird His Creeks might be the leading candidate to be Gras Ignace's fur trade identity. But if you're like me, you think, okay, this is a nice hypothesis, but I feel like we need to test that hypothesis against additional data before we feel really confident. It's very circumstantial, suggestive evidence, nothing like proof. And to do that, I needed to test the hypothesis against an additional body of data. At this point, we've exhausted everything there is to know from the traditional sources, the missionary documents, and so forth. We've now gotten everything that we can learn from the fur trade records. And the only other body of potentially relevant data that I could think of was the sacramental records of Kahnawake mission. Now, a number of scholars in recent decades have dug very deeply into the background of the Iroquois who came west, the contracts that they signed back east, what their lives were like back east, and so forth. But there's been very little citation of sources from the Kahnawake sacramental register. So I came into it expecting them to be very brief or not very valuable. But I quickly discovered that for an enterprising researcher, they're a goldmine of interesting information relevant to the Rocky Mountain fur trade. These are just a few examples of some things I ran across as I was going through. Many of you know that Jim Hardy wrote a book on Pierre's Hole recently, and Pierre's Hole was named after Old Pierre, one of the most famous of the Iroquois trappers. Turned out he was semi-literate and could sign his name, and his autograph is all over these records. There's an example right there of him signing his Iroquois name when he served as a witness for some of the ceremonies at the mission church before he came west. And I also thought it was fascinating that there was a death entry for Louis Canettigon, who was the man who was accidentally shot by his wife on the 1825 expedition. They were out in the middle of nowhere when that happened. They didn't get back to Fort Nez Perce until October of 1825. And by December 30th of 1825, news had already reached Montreal of his death. So it was kind of a fascinating glimpse into the pace at which information travels during that era. But as I got a little deeper, I realized perhaps why these records have not been very thoroughly utilized by historians. The relevant collections consist of about 1,500 pages of often faded and damaged script, mostly in French, Latin, and Iroquois. And so making any progress in the questions that I was interested in required going through these line by line about 6 or 7 times. Several years of extremely tedious work, but it paid off in the end. We were very lucky that Laird His Creek's baptismal record is present and easily identifiable. Only about a third of the time did the missionaries note the Iroquois given name of the babies when they were baptized, which often makes it difficult to connect them with the later identities by which they were known. But we're lucky that Laird His Creeks is one of those who has his Iroquois name there. And this reads, in the year 1799, the 21st day of March, I baptized Ignace, born the day before yesterday, of the legitimate marriage of Louis Sagoyawata and Cecile Kanstenhaue. And so starting from here, I was able to build out at least Laird His Creek's immediate family tree. There are lots of gaps in the register. It doesn't go back too many years. We can't build a complete genealogy, but we could get his immediate family. And as I did that, everything that we knew from the traditional sources about Gras Ignace's immediate family matched exactly what we found for Laird His Creeks. So first we knew from the letter of Father Helias that he was a younger relative of Martin Siniaquin. And it turns out so was Laird His Creeks. We know that because his half-brother Pierre, in his marriage, his wedding was witnessed by a cousin of the groom named Charles Teharongata. And it turns out Charles Teharongata was both the husband of Martin Siniaquin's sister and the uncle of Martin Siniaquin's wife. So even though we can't build out the genealogies enough to see exactly how they're connected, clearly we can say with confidence Laird His Creeks was a younger relative of Martin Siniaquin. There's a very obscure set of manuscript notes that one of the Montana Jesuits made in the late 19th, early 20th century based on conversations with Saksa, Gra Ignace's son. And in that, he mentions that Gra Ignace had a brother named Thomas. And sure enough, so did Laertes Creeks. Finally, there was a ferry operator on the Flathead reservation named Baptiste Ignace. He was said to be a cousin of Saksa, and the implication is that their fathers were brothers. But I always thought that was strange because we know from some other data that Baptiste Ignace's father was also named Ignace. And I thought, well, two brothers wouldn't be named Ignace. There must be some mistake there. Maybe they're more distantly related. But lo and behold, turns out Laertes Creeks had a half-brother also named Ignace. And finally, in the same letter to his mother, Father Helias mentioned that Gra Ignace not only had grown up at Kahnawake, but had actually in some way worked for the missionaries there at the church. And according to the sacramental records, Laertes Creeks, when he was 11 years old, he worked for the missionaries assisting with funerary services at the church. So we're building up this large body of independent lines of evidence. Everything is kind of fitting into place. I feel like I got to this point and felt that this was the most validation I could possibly have expected from this data set, really kind of confirming the hypothesis that I had started out with. But I don't think maybe some people here are fully persuaded that Gra Ignace was Laertes Creeks. I wouldn't call any of this proof, though. It's all just circumstantial evidence, a lot of it. But I was kind of expecting I wouldn't find any proof, but I was hoping there would be. And one day when I was going a little bit later than usual through the sacramental records, I was getting into the 1820s, reaching a point of diminishing returns. There wasn't much left that was relevant, but I came across this burial record of Louis Sagoyewata, the father of Laertes Creeks. He's mentioned about 50 times in the register, always under the name Louis Sagoyewata. But in his burial record, his full name is given as Louis Pertuis, called Sagoyewata. And Pertuis, by that exact spelling, was a French-Canadian surname belonging to a prominent Montreal family whose progenitor had emigrated to the New World in the late 17th century. So evidently, Louis Sagoyewata was half French-Canadian. He seems to have grown up at Kahnawake with a primarily Iroquois identity, but his French ancestry was reflected in his inheritance of the patrilineal surname. And does this surname remind you of anything we've seen before? Well, we now finally know what Father Helias was trying to write in the baptismal record there, Pertuis. Clearly, no question, he was trying. Gra Ignace said his name was Ignace Pertuis, and he was trying to write that here. So I went thoroughly through the sacramental records as well as the earliest censuses from Kahnawake. The very rare uses of Pertuis in those documents are limited to Louis Sagoyewata and his direct male descendants, which means there weren't other families in the community who had this surname. It's extremely unlikely that there were other men from Kahnawake of Laertes Creeks generation named Ignace who also had the surname Pertuis. So really, when we're dealing with this kind of historical information, I feel like this is as close to proof as we can get. And I'm convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Gra Ignace Pertuis of Jesuit lore is the same person as Ignace Laertes Creeks Pertuis of the Western fur trade. Now, why does this matter? And it turns out that establishing this fur trade identity answers numerous questions about Gra Ignace that have puzzled historians over the years. For example, under what circumstances did he come west? Why and when did he retire from the fur business and settle among the Salish? Lots and lots of authors have puzzled over why he traveled to St. Louis instead of returning home to Montreal to ask for missionaries. Identifying him as Laertes Creeks makes it very clear why he couldn't go back to Montreal and why he went to St. Louis instead. It also sheds new light on the context of his Christian evangelization activity. It provides a lot of details on his religious upbringing, and also highlights the complexity of his interpersonal relationships in the Rocky Mountain West, which defy the overly idealized portrait that we have of him in the traditional sources. But in order to find out about all that, because I'm out of time, you have to buy the journal and read the article. So thanks so much. I just want to say a quick word of thanks to everyone who supported the project, the staff at the Journal, particularly Scott Walker, who spent many hours finalizing the text for publication, the anonymous reviewers, my Iroquois language expert who very generously assisted with getting the Iroquois names spelled right and translated. Jean Barman shared some of her research notes. Bob Bigard is a wonderful sounding board in all matters relating to Salish history. And finally, I want to thank my brand new wife, Mary Rose, for putting up with my esoteric interests and letting me cut the honeymoon short to be with you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions?
So making this connection to the Ignace who was killed in 1837 with Gray, there was obviously then a lot of feeling of a respect and or friendship with him from not only from the Salish, but also from the trappers. Is that correct? Because there was somewhat of a bitter reaction to his death.
That is correct. Yeah, so William H. Gray, he was the Presbyterian missionary who was keeping the diary. He was kind of the leader of that party. He was a very difficult character. Really all historians, from whatever perspective they're coming from, even those who are really focusing on the Protestant missionary activity, admit that he was a difficult character. Nobody liked him. And he insisted on leaving the Rendezvous early that year. He was taking with him two sons of the Salish chief Big Face. He wanted them to get educated back east, there was a Spokane youth who had gotten educated and his prestige really increased because of that. And Ignace was probably worried about the safety of these two young men who were traveling with William H. Gray, because Gray wanted to leave before the rest of the party was going. They got to Fort Laramie, I think, and the Indians pleaded with him again, let's wait for the larger caravan to catch up. He said, no, it's going to be fine. And sure enough, the small party was attacked by Lakota. The mountain men were furious because the Salish were furious about the two sons of the chief that had been killed. And they had to work really hard to prevent violence and bloodshed. And they knew it was Gray's fault entirely. Not only that they had left early, but if he had shown the tiniest bit of backbone in that incident, the Lakota would have laid off, because they really didn't want to kill white men because that would have jeopardized their relationship with the traders at the time. So they went up to the party and they got a interpreter who was with them, said, white men, stand aside. We just want to kill the Indians. And Gray was like, okay, sure, and went and stood aside. And the trappers were like, if he had just said, no, I'm not standing aside, they would have let them alone. And there was a lot of bitterness back there. Some of it may have been because they respected Ignace so much, no doubt, but I think it also had to do with the fact that the two sons of the chief were killed as part of that after he had entrusted them and their safety to Gray. Need the microphone.
How extensive of the research involved, like St. Louis University, or where? I just can't understand how the heck you put all this together.
So, I mean, I've been working for years with the sources relevant to the kind of early mission enterprise in Western Montana. So I have some familiarity with, the archives that house a lot of that material. Some of it is in the kind of Pacific Northwest area, but a large body of it, particularly that related to Father de Smet's papers, is still in St. Louis. Some of it's actually in Rome as well, but St. Louis University has microfilm copies of most of the relevant material from the European archives.
What about the HBC Freeman? Can you expound on that a little?
Sure. So what we think of as like companies engaging in economic activity, that concept was just kind of coming into existence in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And so these endeavors that involved high risk and high return, high upfront capital investment were beginning to form kind of legal entities like we think of as companies that do all economic activity. And relationship between employer, employee, and how that worked is a little bit different from today and was still evolving. But basically, the Hudson's Bay Company had what were called engaged men who were kind of like what we would think of as employees. And they also had what were called freemen, who were what we might think of as contract workers, who would sign up for, they would join a brigade, they would be outfitted, which means that the company would provide them with their traps, their guns, their ammunition, the other equipment that they would need. And they would be indebted to the company because of that outlay of equipment. And then they would be on their own. They could trap as many furs as they wanted, keep track of which were theirs. And then when they came back, they would sell those furs back to the company. It would offset their debts. And maybe if they're lucky, they'd have a little bit left over that they could then use to purchase goods from the company. A little more background. When the Hudson's Bay Company took over, merged with the Northwest Company in 1822, they basically had a parliamentary monopoly on the entire region that we're talking about, really overall economic activity in the region. So the Iroquois, who had originally been with the Northwest Company and had some very favorable contracts with them, suddenly found themselves under a very different managerial structure. And the Hudson's Bay Company took advantage of its monopoly position to inflate the prices for goods that they would charge and really pay low for the furs. And this caused a lot of discontent among the freemen because they weren't really getting the deal they thought they were going to get when they originally signed up, and is the basis for the famous desertion in 1825, and many of the freemen went over to the Americans. And we'll do this one first, and then Jim. Yeah.
Does Gray's diary indicate what they did with the people that were killed at that point?
It said they were butchered in the most horrible manner. Mm-hmm. And they were probably cut to pieces. And yeah.
Hey, George, when Smith, Jackson, and Sublette sold out to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company,
Mm-hmm.
they wrote bank drafts to a number of the men. And one of those existing bank drafts was made to Martin Iroquois.
Mm-hmm.
Do you suppose this Martin from the Martin's band was still active in the fur trade at that point, and that this would be the same Martin?
I suspect that it's the same Martin. There were Bruce Watson in his he basically went through and tried to keep track or identify every individual known by name that is present in the records who worked for the fur companies west of the Rocky Mountains. He could only identify 2 Iroquois named Martin from the 1820s, 1830s period. And we know that Martin Sineaquin died in 1831, 1832. And so that's why, and the other Martin is present in the records beyond that. And so that's why we know that this uncle of Gras Ignace's named Martin must have been Martin Sineaquin. Take that back. We know that Gras Ignace's uncle Martin died in 1831, 1832, so he could not have been the other Martin who lived later. So that particular record could have been either one. I don't think that Martin was he was not active with the Hudson's Bay Company because he had deserted, but he may have spent some time with the American mountaineers. We think that he settled with the Salish along with Gras Ignace, but the Salish often attended the rendezvous, and so it's entirely possible that he would have signed that banknote. I think that was just published a year or two ago in the journal, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Martin carried that note around for 2 years before he cashed it in. He received it in 1830. So he traded it for goods at the 1832 rendezvous.
Okay.
So he was still alive in 32.
Okay. So it could have been the other Martin then who was active in the early 1830s and was still alive as of 1833.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Judge.
much. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next talk will be presented by me. And my name is Scott Walker. I'm the editor of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. The presentation I'm going to be doing today was not an article in the journal. However, because of difficulties of travel and so forth, some of our authors for this year's articles couldn't make it to this presentation. What I'll be talking about today is popular music at the time of the Rendezvous. And as a bit of an introduction as we get set up here, I've always been interested in history, but at a formative period of my life when I was in my late teens, I hired on as a living history interpreter with the National Park Service. And anyone who's involved in living history or the AMM or anything that tries to use the material culture and portray the lives of people of the past, realize that what you're talking about is not a timeline, but a sphere that envelops the people you're interpreting. And when I say a sphere, everything in a person's life basically makes them who they are and what they are. And it includes things like food, it includes things like your upbringing, your religious education, your academic education, it includes music. And so for years, I've been interested in music and trying to figure out what you would have heard had you been here at the time of one of these rendezvous. And I realized that not only are we talking about the music that would have been heard at Rendezvous, but the music that would have been heard by the trappers as they were coming up and what they would have been exposed to once they were out here in the mountains. So I'm going to be doing a whirlwind tour of popular music of the 1820s through 30s, or pardon me, 40s. And when I say whirlwind, music is a huge subject, and I only have time to touch on this. You've got to imagine a time that is before recorded music. Recorded music has changed, entirely changed how we experience music and in some ways what we use music for. A good example of that is my mother was born and raised as a young woman in Tennessee, East Tennessee. Her grandfather collected ballads and folk songs that he heard around that part of Tennessee and taught them to my mother. And it turned out as I got older and started remembering the tunes that I had learned as a child, and in some cases been sung to me as a lullaby, that these were the tunes of that time in the Appalachians when you made your own music. And one of the reasons you would make music is to give you rhythm or keep you from getting bored in the chores you were doing. So one of the things music did in that period before recorded music, you couldn't just turn on a radio, was to provide rhythm to your work. Any job that had a pattern of rhythm and movement to it had music that went to it. A perfect example are the sea shanties. And one of the very rhythmic sailors' tunes that were often heard had to do with keeping people organized as they brought up the anchor on sailing ships. That's a capstan that they're walking around. And I'm going to play a little bit of Where's Waldo with you. Is mark every time you see a fiddler in these illustrations that I found in period sources. So that keeps the people organized as they're working the capstan and keeps them from tripping over each other. Now, there were other rhythmic jobs. One of these was fulling of cloth. In Northern Scottish traditional culture, the hand weavers would full their cloth in a process they called walking, W-A-U-L-K-E-R, or I-N-G. And they would stitch the fabric end to end and make a big loop of it, and they would work it as they passed it back and forth. And they had music for that, again, rhythmic. Those walking songs always sound Native American to me, but they're in Gaelic. The rhythmic music, work music that intersected with the fur trade was the music of the voyageurs. And it was the music by which they would keep their canoe paddles in tune. Now, in addition, there was sacred music. And one of the strong traditions in the earlier period of the Rendezvous was shape note music, which was a way to write music to indicate the sharps and flats without a key signature. So that basically it lets you know as you were reading the tune where a person without musical accompaniment, no musical instruments, had to sharpen or flatten their voice to keep in tune. Now, this tradition is still strong in the South, and it's also strong as a hobby in some of the, for instance, I live in Chicago, and the Old Town School of Folk Music sometimes hosts people who are singing shape note hymns. This is Amazing Grace, which in this particular shape note book was called New Britain. And you can see the different shapes of the heads of the notes. Now, in addition to that, in the church services where they use this kind of singing, they often arrange themselves so that the person directing the music stands in the middle of the square. And they arrange the singers around them, and the singers all faced inward. This is not really an expression of a performance or outward presentation. This is an expression of joy and praise. I have a friend who had a chance to stand in the middle and conduct one of these squares, and she said it was a transcendent experience. It just carried her. But this form of music, the shape note music that was designed for congregations that didn't have musical accompaniment, was soon had a competitor, and it was Lowell Mason, whose picture you see here. And he decided that church music needed to be more professional. And so he wrote out a careful and professional hymnal that was one of the earliest hymnals in the United States. And many of his songs are still sung today. And their presentation was well beyond most congregations who had amateur choirs and didn't have the music education. So this was kind of a competition between the professional musicians and the country choirs. And the reason that Lowell Mason is important to the fur trade is Samuel Parker, an early Methodist missionary who came out in the 1830s. He talks about reaching Fort Laramie, and at Fort Laramie, he saw how many people have been to Fort Laramie? Have you looked west and seen the peak on the horizon? The peak it's Laramie Peak. It's out by Wheatland. And if you stand in the right place around Fort Laramie, you see that peak. And for many immigrants and trappers and so forth who were going west for the first time, Laramie Peak was their first sight of the Rocky Mountains, and as big as they were. Mason saw the Rocky Mountains, and he says he sang out a hymn, which these days is sung primarily as a Christmas hymn, but it has a reference to seeing the mountains in the distance and knowing that he must cross them. If I can. I'm not getting the cursor. And then we come to social music. And a lot of the social music of this period has come down to us through old time fiddle music. Sometimes these tunes have made it into bluegrass. And again, you're talking about a period before radios, before recorded music. You had to make your own fun, as my grandmother used to say. And so there were two main traditions of dancing at this time, the English tradition and the French tradition. And it controlled which kinds of dance figures you did. But for the most part, note that the dancers are not touching one another, and that any group you could get together of two couples, you could have a dance if you had a fiddler or someone who could make a rhythm for you. And also keep watching for the fiddlers. This is George Caleb Bingham's sketch of a fiddler amongst the boatmen on the Missouri or the Mississippi. Also note that Hollywood would have you think that most country fiddlers fiddled from the elbow. But while that certainly did happen, you'll notice that most of the fiddlers, or a lot of the fiddlers in our illustrations, are fiddling more or less the way that modern fiddlers would hold their fiddle. The French Canadian tradition This is a dance in Montreal in 1810. You can see the fiddler. You can see that he's using one of the old, what we would call Baroque bows that's actually looks like an archery bow. You can see the percussion people with their hand drums and the tambour. And there's a flautist there. And there's a French form dance. I'm not. What you just heard is also an example of what's called a crooked tune. And a crooked tune is not divided into measures as we think of them. You start playing at the beginning and you play all the way to the end. This next tune I'm going to play is a Métis tune, also a crooked tune. And you'll hear that it just starts out at 60 miles an hour, stays at 60 miles an hour, and goes all the way to the end. The Métis were really big at dancing jigs and are to this day. The Métis you've probably heard most about are the Red River Métis, who were centered around Winnipeg in Manitoba. There's a community of Métis in Lewiston, Montana as well. If you go on YouTube and hunt around, you'll find YouTube tapes of Métis weddings, and they could be illustrated by this drawing. A lot of joy, energy, and that kind of 60-mile-an-hour fiddle playing. Now, as far as what instruments made it out here to Rendezvous, we have not that many clues, but this is one of them. I figure that guy on the far right, your far right, either is playing a Jew's harp or he's doing what his dentist told him to do, which is floss every day. Banjos would have been known. People like, well, most of the mountaineers who came through Kentucky or some of the southern states would have certainly seen the banjo being played by enslaved people all through the South. But the banjo hadn't reached the prominence that it did just 10 or 15 years later. So my educated guess, I've seen no reference to a banjo at Rendezvous, but banjos on the Oregon Trail or during the time of the Mexican War, or especially by the time you reach the Civil War, they became more and more important. This is an example of a banjo, primitive banjo, which would have been fretless, so you have to know where to put your fingers to get the right tune. Guitars, I know of one primary source, or I'll accept it as a primary source, of a guitar at Rendezvous, and that was in William Drummond Stewart's novel, Edward Warren. And he talks about playing a guitar that he borrows from some people who come up from New Mexico, which makes sense. The guitar was a very important instrument down in New Mexico. Then the rhythm instruments that I showed you earlier, the hand drums and tambours. There was a description of a dance up on the upper Missouri at a trading post that basically they had one fiddler and they had a drummer and they had a dance. The fiddle was extremely important to popular music at this time. Again, notice the way he's holding it. The fiddle was slightly different than what we're used to. The form of the body and the wood of the fiddle was fully developed by the late 1700s. So that wouldn't be different. But chin rests were very rare. The strings of all stringed stringed instruments at that time would have been made of gut. And there were no fine tuners. And my guess is a lot of these people, they tuned their instruments based on the TLAR system, or actually this would be the TSAR system. That sounds about right. And so they would probably all tune to a single note and then tune their instruments to match each other if there were several instruments. But there was no such thing as a concert master playing an A. Something I found fascinating about music of this period was the strong influence of the circus. This is Mr. Astley, a horse master, and he was a noted riding instructor who started putting on performances of trick riding to promote his horseback riding course. And that turned into one of the earliest forms of circus. So pretty soon he's advertising what his students can do and their trick riding. And these circuses needed something to fill in the time between setting up for the next horse exhibition. And that was where dancers started to come in. In England, it was hornpipe dancers. A lot of them did what was called an egg dance, where you'd lay down parallel lines of eggs, blindfold the dancer, and he would do a hornpipe dance through the eggs, trying to show that he could remember where all the eggs were and not crush any of them with his feet. Durang was one of the famous hornpipe dancers of this time. This is a painting he did of himself doing his famous sailor's hornpipe. Those of you who know the traditional music that's passed down to today, you may have come across some of the hornpipes that keep the names from this period. Astley's hornpipe, Ricketts' hornpipe. Ricketts was actually an employee of Astley who learned the business and then ran away and started his own circus. And then I love this, Durang's hornpipe, composed by Mr. Hofmaster, a German dwarf. And Fisher's hornpipe is one that you'll hear commonly even to this day. And I found it interesting that in, I think it was the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the Hollywood music composers co-opted Fisher's hornpipe. And they used that to be the musical background of a bar brawl. Now, another huge influence in American popular music was the African-American influence. You had musicians, both enslaved and free, who worked as dance musicians. And again, look at how he's holding his fiddle. And the gentleman who's doing a dance, I believe, is doing what's called a wing dance, which was one of the traditional African-American dances that was a blend of African, Irish, and British Isles, other British Isles dancing styles that influenced American popular dance. Anybody who knows the Southern Appalachians, in fact, you can see this on YouTube, go on YouTube and look up flatfoot dancing, and it's descended from this type of dancing. Now, the African-American tradition, as it blended with the British Isles tradition, was producing really good music. And that led to the blackface minstrel performances. So basically you had groups of white musicians who performed in caricature of African-American characters. And some of the names of these characters have come down even to us today as shorthand for prejudices that come from the slavery times. This is Dan Emmett in blackface. when I first saw this picture, I thought, okay, is he going on a night commando raid? What is this? But the performance was done by white people blackening their faces and doing caricatures of Negro music and dance. He is also sometimes credited as being the composer of the tune Dixie. And the music from this period has also become controversial in the last few years. A lot of ice cream trucks in the cities, at least in the eastern US, have taped music so the kids can hear the ice cream truck coming down the street. And one of the tunes that seems to pop up a lot is Turkey in the Straw, which actually traces to an old minstrel tune, which originally had outright racist lyrics. So those people, it must have been outraged. Historians who knew the story of this have said this is not appropriate for our ice cream trucks. But this group, this is a musical group called the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And in about 2010, they were looking at the African-American tradition of folk music, and they said, it's good music. Let's disconnect it from the minstrel shows and start recreating it again. So I highly recommend this group. They put out some great music. And also, you know, I've been saying, where's Waldo? Where's the fiddler? Have you noticed anything about a lot of the fiddlers? Many of them in these period illustrations are Black. And so that's another way that Black African-American influence on American music is a big part of why we have American music, not just a Xerox copy of British Isles or European music. Let's see, did I miss? Now, you may wonder to yourself, how did these people know these dance figures? As early as the early 1800s, there were manuals. Before that, there were dancing masters, at least in Europe and the British Isles, who would teach you the latest steps. This is an outstanding guide to country dancing as it was about 1820. And it not only includes the instructions for the dances, but it includes the sheet music for the tunes themselves. It's like a time capsule, a look into music as it was and dance as it was. Now, I have 2 left feet. I do not dance. So those of you who are perhaps country dancers or square dancers might be able to interpret the instructions, but they seem pretty clear to me. And this is a perfect example of the kind of page and information you get out of Wilson's Guide to English Country Dance. And this particular tune, Roger de Coverley, was called a finishing dance because there was no real end to it. You just went as long as the musicians and dancers wanted to go. I came across a reference to a country dance in Canada that went for 2 hours during this dance, and they wouldn't let the musicians stop. This dance also appears in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, when Scrooge is taken back to Fezziwig's dance as a fine memory of his youth. They refer to, we're going to dance the Sir Roger. And in some of the films that have been made of the Christmas Carol, listen for the tune, you'll hear it. And the interesting thing about Sir Roger de Coverley as a dancing form is it is basically the Virginia reel. It's a very early form of the Virginia reel, which to my mortification, my elementary school, a teacher in 3rd grade made us dance with the girls and do the Virginia reel. Now, many of the trappers found themselves in the Southwest. They went to New Mexico, which had a strong musical tradition. They had a strong fandango, a dance tradition. Their social dances tended to be the waltz. The rendezvous is a little bit earlier than the polka being common. Now, trying to figure out what tunes were being used in New Mexico and the Southwest at this time is fairly difficult because there was a wave of European music, polkas and more modern waltzes that hit in the 1850s and 60s. And a lot of what's considered New Mexican old time music can only be traced back that far. But it did have a particular sound to it. And the travelers like Matt Field and others who went down the Santa Fe Trail commented when they got to Santa Fe that they were dancing to the same instruments, fiddle and guitar, that they would hear in church if they went to church on Sunday. So that's how they made the music. Now, also, there's an issue of how many people actually read music back then. And from what I've read, my theory is that if you went back to people who were trying to live a cultured life in the 13 colonies, many of them reading music would be part of their education. As America expanded and access to trained teachers became more difficult, there was more and more of learning by ear. This is just my theory. So that by the time we reach the early 20th century, especially in the Southern Appalachians and some of the more rural areas, you had outstanding musicians who couldn't read any notes. But at the same time, in the United States and also imported from Scotland, England, France, were collections of music. One of the most important collections in America was this one on the right. And it was a Knopf collection. And what's interesting about it was it was published in 1839. So it's in our period. And this fellow didn't play fiddle, he played pianoforte. But he was collecting music that was popular in his part of Virginia for dancing and put it in this collection. And this is available online if you hunt a little bit. And what's wonderful about written music, it's kind of like mathematics. It's a language that can just transcend time, because what he wrote down in 1839, you can read and play today. Another way the music transmitted was by broadside. And these were printed lyrics for tunes that were popular at the time. Sometimes they included the sheet music and sometimes they were just the lyrics. This tune on the right was a tune that my mom in the 1950s was singing me as a lullaby. And it dates back clear to the early 19th century. And she was singing it pretty much just like that, as she had learned it from her grandfather. And in an ironic twist, my mom's father got interested in radio in the 1920s. He built himself a crystal set. And because he had the only crystal set in that holler, that made him the radio technician. And slowly he came up with the industry, and eventually he was in the 1930s broadcasting out of Knoxville, broadcasting country and Western music as it grew through the 50s. He eventually went into TV, but I always found it ironic that my mom was collecting an oral tradition from her grandfather while her father was creating radio, which was kind of the death of the traditional music being so fluid. So then you have musicians, if they were learning by ear, they listened to the radio and they played it the way they heard it on the radio, not the way they heard it in their particular holler. Another way that we know what they actually were playing was barrel organs. Barrel organs had, and you can see the cylinders in there, cylinders with little wire spikes in them that tripped keys inside the barrel organ. You turned a big crank on its side, and as the wire went by, it played a tune. So all of a sudden you have the tune actually set. And where this intersects with the fur trade is that ship's captains had realized they had to keep their sailors exercised. Now, a lot of times they bring a fiddler on board, and his job was to play tunes while the sailors were basically forced to dance to get some exercise while they were at sea. But some ships' captains actually took a barrel organ, and one of those ended up in Mission San Juan Capistrano and is there to this day. And we can look at the cylinders that came with that instrument, that barrel organ, and know that the priests at San Juan Capistrano were listening to sacred music, but they also had one for Go to the Devil and Shake Yourself, which is a classic jig. This is what they sound like. So you've got someone sitting there turning this thing like a great big coffee grinder. And while I opened up this talk by talking about this was a period before pre-recorded music, in a sense, this is recorded music. And this is another popular dance tune of the time. So again, the guy's turning the crank, and you can have a dance. And this is the barrel organ at San Juan Capistrano. Still there. Now, that was the barrel organ at San Juan Capistrano, and it's still there. Now, as far as identifying specific tunes that made it out here, the evidence is kind of sparse, but there is John Townsend's journal mentions that they captured a baby antelope that they tried to raise. Eventually it broke its leg and died. But they named it Zip Coon, which was the original name of the tune we now call Turkey in the Straw. Another tune that I'm very certain made it out here is Hunters of Kentucky. A few years ago, I wrote a short article about that. There was a Nez Perce Indian who learned to sing this tune phonetically and went around to the trappers' camps singing it for them. And they gave him the nickname of Kentuck. And Kentuck turns up over and over again through the expansion period of the Oregon Territory. The song Hunters of Kentucky celebrates the Battle of New Orleans. And if any of the AMM people here want to learn one song, this probably ought to be it. It's a fun song, and we can prove it was at the Rendezvous of 1834. Another tune that William Drummond Stewart recorded as being sung at Rendezvous was Meet Me at Moonlight, or Meet Me by Moonlight Alone. And it is a sappy, no, I don't want to predispose you to have an opinion on this. I'll let you judge for yourself. So what do you think, sappy or? Also, William Drummond Stewart in his novel Edward Warren talked about Kit Carson singing a tune that was called Bruce's March at Bannockburn. And that's what we today know as Scots Wha Hae While Wallace Bled, which is basically a bloody musical account of the movie Braveheart. Also, Stewart recorded. Sorry about that. I should have put the lapel mic on. Stewart recorded a German who was at Rendezvous singing a Kushkushku song, which this gentleman, Theodore Kushkushku, I'm probably butchering the last name and I apologize to all Polish speakers, was a patriot. He was one of the Polish volunteers who came over during the American Revolution and served with much honor in the Continental Army. He was considered such an exemplary person that in the fights that Poland had with Russia for their own independence, his music that referred to him was considered a high point in patriotic music. But once again, kind of Scots Wha Hae While Wallace Bled for Poles, still the On to Victory and Never Mind the Blood. And a really quick aside, my mom used to sing border Scottish ballads to me when I was a child as lullabies. And I learned a lot of these as I was growing up. So when my daughter was born, I decided I would pass that on. I'm even choking up at the thought of it. I thought this was something that I could bring to my child that I had had from my childhood. And so my wife heard me sing the first one that talked about heads rolling and blood spilling on the floor. And she says, not with my daughter. So I had to pick out the cleanest of them. Cleanest, I mean, in terms of blood. Now, I haven't really addressed Native American music, but it would have been everywhere. The trappers interacted with the Native Americans out here, the tribes out here, and would have heard music constantly. In their culture, they have music for work, music for celebration, music for worship, or for spiritual expression. It is something that I don't feel qualified to speak about, but I want to mention it because it really was part of the trappers' sphere of music. Now, I tried to get an idea of what a rendezvous would have sounded like musically. So I started with the idea of trappers dancing around a fire, almost like we did at Three Worlds Meet. So let me give you my impression of what rendezvous would have sounded like. not exactly Beethoven, but I think it has a certain ring to it. Any questions?
Thank you, Scott. That was fabulous.
thanks.
I've just got a couple of comments, if I may. And for this gathering, maybe in the future, there's an individual I know, Dennis Stromat. He's performed for the Library of Congress. He's from the old mines area of Missouri. He plays the fiddle extraordinarily, but he's captured all the old keelboat songs and things like that. And he is marvelous. You can find him online, Lagione or Lagione, but you'll find it. But he's a marvelous performer.
That's a great suggestion.
That's a good thing. I want to also, if I may, the earliest instance I've ever found of a white individual is John Doherty, blacking his face and, as recorded in a journal, sang Negro songs. The year was 1824. Fast forward now to his great grandson. He is identified as one of the foremost song catchers in our American South, and actually was jailed for bringing in a black woman to his house to record her song.
That's interesting.
And then one last comment, I might say, the shape note songbooks. I've led many a shape note song from the pulpit of a Campbellite church. Campbellite church do not have musical instruments. I will say also, we never got to go to dances. I mean, dang sure never got to drink. And all I can say now is that if there was a Campbellite at a gathering, a rendezvous, he was a reprobate.
Well, my dad was born in Western North Carolina, and as it turns out, he was within a few miles of two of the best known North Carolina fiddlers, Marcus Martin and Manco Sneed. And I asked my dad if he had ever heard them at dances around where he grew up. And he said, my mother was raised a hard shell Baptist, and we weren't going to dance and we weren't going to play cards. So, oh well.
And I couldn't run track practice or wrestling practice on Wednesday evening.
Did you ever get to stand in the center of the square?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, in 1919, Cecil Sharp, maybe you're familiar with him, it was in England, and he saw the Morris dancers, which was the pagan, going back to Queen Elizabeth and all that. And actually it's through those that dancing became a part of Christian England. But he cataloged all these dances as well as some of the folk music, which actually, when he came back to this country, were basically the figures of modern contemporary square dance and round dance, as well as the music. And so a lot of that came westward as well. But there was also a professor, I forget his name right now, but anyway, he taught a class called the Literature of the Southern Highlands from West Virginia University, and he collected folk music too. And he went to the homes in the hills of the Howlers and whatever. But you talked the one song you mentioned up there, "Will You Meet Me Tonight?" That was I have that in my repertoire. But at the same time, A.P. Carter took another version of that.
There's a different tune to it.
Right, same melody, different words, different lyrics.
Well, I hope I didn't upset you by calling it sapping. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.